All right, so we created the greeting component. We imported it into our app component, someplace where we could see it actually on the screen. And then our greeting component, voila, shows up. And one of the great things about components is, like any other HTML element, you can use it as many times as you need to, wherever you need to. So you make a component one time, and you could use it over and over and over again. As many times as you need or want. You could use it when we get to multi-page apps where you actually have different pages and stuff. You can use the same component in different places. It's a very handy feature. Build something one time, and then you can just use it wherever you need it. Yes.
Are components always HTML?
Yeah, that's the whole point of what it is. Yeah, so just to reiterate on that point, because that's actually a good question. The whole point of a component is it's building some part of the user interface. It's rendering something to the screen. That's why the definition of a functional component is a function, single parameter, returns JSX. If it doesn't return JSX, it's just a function doing something, which you can have just regular functions performing other tasks for you, which is actually common. But a component itself is, the whole point of it is it's building something that's going to render onto the screen. So if we take a quick look at what that looks like, it looks pretty much what you'd expect it to. You see, every time we did it, shows up. And then what's very important about JSX is it works the exact way HTML works. Okay, so the order you put stuff in, that's the order that it's going to show up in the screen. I know some of you might be like, well, duh, but it's not directly obvious to everybody, and even if you are saying that, it might not have been as obvious as you think it was to you. So, but for example, if I throw an H1 here in the middle, or an H2, so what we should see now is we should see two of our greetings, the H2, and then two more of the greetings. And we can see our nice little H2 that doesn't have any styling added to it, chilling there in the middle. All right, so that is a function component in its most simplest form. But one of the huge benefits to components is you can actually pass information into a component. Okay, so instead of just having a greeting, we can make it a little bit more customizable by passing information into it. And we pass information into a component via props. So props, if you recall from yesterday, are just like HTML attributes. Okay? So there's on your regular HTML elements, props are stuff like class, onClick, all the different stuff that you use in normal HTML, ID. The ones you guys are probably most familiar with is class and ID, of course. With the exception being that it's class name instead of class, that we kind of hit on yesterday. But with a custom component, you could pass any information into it that you desire. So for example, on greeting, we could pass a name property or a name prop into it. So this allows us to pass information into the component. So now inside of the component, we could access this information. Anybody still need a second here? So over in our actual definition of our component, any key value pairs we pass onto our component as props. So this is a key value pair, okay, just like any normal attribute, gets added to props. Props is an object. And it's a one-to-one mapping. Every single key value pair that you put on your component will get added into the props object in the exact same way that you added it onto the component. So what that looks like when we actually run this is we get the props object and we see it 4 different times because we used our component 4 different times. Each time we pass a different name into it. Okay, so you're seeing those 4 different console logs from every time that function was called. Okay, props is always an object. Even if you don't pass anything in, it will just be an empty object. We'll circle back around to that in just a second. But since we have an object with a name property, we could use that information to greet whoever the greeting is for. So if I want to add JavaScript inside of my JSX, what do I use? What's it called? JavaScript expression. So I would say props dot name. It's just an object where it's the exact same as any object ever would. Okay. Another thing you're gonna get sick of me saying is that it's still just JavaScript. And I do deep down inside understand that it's more complex than that. But at the same time, all the same rules do still apply. Yes, sir.
What is the JavaScript React supposed to help, like shorten? So far, I've been like trying to use it or like tab out of stuff, but it hasn't been finishing.
Are you using PHP Storm or
VS Code?
VS Code? Yeah, so you should be able to, as long as you're within the right place, you should be able to use like all the emit abbreviations where you tap like H1 tab and it builds the elements and stuff for you. Is that not working or?
I thought that was working.
Yeah, if it's just JavaScript, that stuff doesn't work normally unless you have some kind of extension that makes it work.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right. So we access props.name. This is name because we called it name here. If we called it something different here, then it would be different inside the component. We'll play around with that right after we look at this. So if we come look at the render, we can see that we have our 4 different greetings to 4 different people. So one big, benefit of this is you can make a component that has a specific task, but it can still be customizable based on information you pass into it. You could have a button that you could pass custom text into. You could pass like a color property. So then you can have an overall formatted button, but then you can change the color, change the text, different stuff by passing props into it. So it makes components that much more reusable. Let's play around with props a little bit more though. So if we, in our app, let's comment all but one of these out. Commenting in JSX could be a little wonky. So some code editors it works, some it doesn't. But what it should do is it should surround it in curly brackets and then use a JavaScript multi-line comment out. If yours just puts the // next to it, that's going to break. It has to go into JavaScript mode and then use a JavaScript comment. That is probably one of the only real downsides to JSX is commenting stuff out is very weird. I usually try and avoid doing stuff like this. If I'm going to comment it out, I'll just cut it out, just delete it. And then if I need it back, Control Z or make sure I select it and copy it. Or cut it so it's on my clipboard. I can paste it back if I need it. But for this example, we'll just use comments. All right, so as mentioned before, these key value pairs, it's a one-to-one relationship with what their props object is going to have. So first off, what I originally said is if you don't pass anything in, the props object still exists. It just exists as an empty object. So you can see greeting props down here in my console. And it is indeed just an empty object. Okay, so it's always there. One nice thing that React does for you too is if you ever try and put like undefined or null or something like that into a JSX element, it just doesn't render it. Because notice it didn't like say undefined up here or anything, it just doesn't show up. So it actually does checks for that kind of stuff. And if it's undefined, it just ignores it. Or null, it ignores null as well. All right. So if we put name back on here, we could also add all kinds of other stuff. We could add like fave color. We could add age. Now, we could use, not only can we use JavaScript expressions to set text inside of HTML elements, we can also use JavaScript expressions to set props. So we can say curly brackets and then actually set it to a number. Or we could pass it a variable if we needed to. You can do all kinds of different stuff. Yep. Yeah, we'll get to that. That's when it starts to get really fun. Yeah, we'll be maybe even as soon as tomorrow, we'll be passing functions from a component that goes to a component that goes down to another component. And then keeping track of all that's always a lot of fun. All right, so now if we look at the console, greeting props now has name, favorite color, and age. Okay, it has exactly what we put here. Okay, whatever you put here in key value pairs gets added to the props object that gets passed to your component. It's a one-to-one relationship. It's a concept that once you understand it, it's like really simple, but it's so simple that people have a hard time with it. But that also on my end makes it a little bit hard to explain any further than what I've already explained. Because there's not much more I could say about it than every key value pair that you put onto the component will get added to the object that gets passed to the function when it gets called. And one thing that I think screws with people is that we're never directly like calling this or anything. So you got to remember you're inside of a framework. So there is some quote unquote magic happening behind the scenes. So behind the scenes, somewhere the greeting function is actually getting called. And what React did is it took all these key value pairs that you put here and turned them into an object for you. And then when it calls your component, in this case our greeting function, it passes us that object that it built from these key value pairs. Another thing that I think people have a hard time with is, well, how do I know what props I'm going to pass into it when I write the function? Well, that's something you have to decide when you're writing the function. You have the ability to name stuff whatever you want. Like here we're building a greeting, so it would make sense that we pass in a name property that will be the person's name. So when we write it, we can say props.name, and we just have to make sure when we use the component that we pass it a name. But React doesn't, by default, it doesn't do any kind of checking. Like if I use props.name here, and on this first one, I'm passing in favorite color and age, and then on the rest of these, I pass in all kinds of different stuff. Title is Joe. What's something else I could use? Okay, so this is still going to work just fine. However, for all of these other ones, no name is going to show up because we didn't pass in a name prop. Okay, so it's not going to break anything, but it's also not going to work as expected. Okay, you have to pass in the stuff that when you define the component, you use specific names. You have to make sure you are using those names when you pass the information in. So we can see here's all of the different components as they rendered. The first one we have name, favorite color, age. That goes to a person, title, and then friend. And notice only the first one actually displays a person's name because that's the only one that we used name. Now down the road, there are ways to force people to use the proper prop names and to require specific information when someone uses your component. You could actually add some code to this that will actually have it throw errors or something if people pass you the wrong information, or if you require a specific property, like say we required name. If someone tried to use greeting without name, it would then throw an error. Okay? Time permitting, we'll get to that down the road. But it's not integral to actually learning React right off the gate. All right, so go back to commenting these other ones out. Go back to just having the one. So what we could do in greeting is we could handle if there is no name passed to us. Okay? We could do a check and we could see, hey, is there a name? If not, we could do one thing. If there is, we could do something else. What does that sound like in JavaScript terms? An if statement, a conditional, right? Okay, so what we could do is we could say, if props.name, remember, any string with characters in it is what type of value? So truthy value in terms of an if statement, right? So as long as props.name is equal to something, it'll evaluate to true. So if that is true, then we could return that message. Otherwise, we could return something completely different. Okay, so you can conditionally return stuff out of your components. This is really handy down the road for when you're waiting for data from your server to get to you. You can return a loading message. If your data isn't there yet, you can check for your data. If it's not there, return some kind of loading thing. If your data is there, display the data. It's also great for you building modals. If the modal is open, display the modal. If the modal is closed, display nothing, or display a button to open the modal. It gives you a lot of flexibility with what you could do, and very easily. So if I save that and then over in app.js, uncomment one of these very carefully. It's like surgery. There we go. So now if we run that, we can see we get welcome guest for the second one. So even though we were passing some type of information in, person is Amanda, we were never actually passing the name property in though. And that's the only thing we were checking for. How's everyone doing?
Good.
How's props feeling to you guys?
Good so far.
Good so far? I said there's not that much more to them. I mean, the whole point of props, this is a good thing to write down. Props are how you get information from the outside world into a component. And that's the whole purpose of that, is to get information into the component from outside of itself. All right, and then as a side little bonus, since we were passing favorite color into our greeting component, we can make what's called a style object. Now, there's a whole little lecture that we're going to talk about styles and images and how all that comes into play. But as a little sneak peek, one way you can add styles to any of your elements is using what's called a style object. So I can say const, and I'll give it some kind of unique name. Normally you would just call it something like style, but when I do that, then people think you have to call it style. So typing a really long name, show that the name of it doesn't matter. It's just an object holding data. The actual name of it is irrelevant. All right, and then inside of your style object, you could add any CSS property that you want. So how do we change font color? Not even one person said font color. So ashamed of you guys. All right, so color. And we want to set it to the value of the favorite color that was passed in. So we could say props.fav color. And then we could do a very easy inline check in case a favorite color was not passed in. We could say or the string white. You could set any variable that way. Okay? If the first thing is false, it'll just go to the next thing in the OR statement because of the way OR statements work. All right, and then to add our style information to an element, you use style, just like you do inline styles in regular HTML, equal. Since we're setting it to a variable, we need to use curly brackets and then pass it our style object. So if you look at it now, Jim likes blue, so his greeting is now blue. And if we update Amanda's to be name, Amanda seems like she would like hot pink. Okay, now it's hot pink. It's less hot pink on the projector than it is on my screen, but. And so you can do all kinds of neat stuff like that. What else is important is the different types of data you can pass via props. Okay? Anything you can store into a variable, you can pass via props. So strings, numbers, booleans, null, arrays, objects, functions. You can even pass other components. Okay? You can pass pretty much anything through props. I can't think of a good reason why you want to pass a component, but you could technically do it. So but what else we could do is we could, of course, most of the time you're not going to be hard coding information like this. You're going to have a variable that holds some information, and then you're going to use that variable to pass information in. So let's say we have a user. They have a name. A favorite color. And that's all they need. All right, so we could use that user information to set our properties, information we're passing in. So name, instead of using quotes, because I'm using a variable, I need to use a what? Curly bracket JavaScript expression. So I could say user dot name. And then do the same for favorite color, curly bracket, user dot favorite color. So now our first greeting should greet who? Paul, right? Paul, because that's the name we're passing into it. So I should say, hello, Paul. And what color should the text be? Yellow. Allegedly. As long as nothing broke. Yellow and pink kind of go good together. Less so up there, but. Everyone still doing okay? Anybody having issues? Lost? So the next thing I'm going to show you is a tip/trick, I guess. This isn't something that you have to use. I'm just going to show it to you as an added bonus. And we will encounter it again later down the road, and I'll explain it again then. But just as kind of a little preview of some cool stuff you can do, because our object has names that exactly match the properties being passed in, so name, favorite color, there's actually a shorthand way you could write that stuff. So instead of writing it all out, I can just directly put curly brackets, and then I can say ... user. That will spread out any object and create key value pairs of what the object contains. Okay, so it's still doing name equals Paul, favorite color equals yellow, and any other key value pairs that are in that object. This will come in handy down the road because sometimes you get large objects and you want to pass all the information through. So we do something like this so we don't have to type everything out manually. When we encounter it again, though, we will talk about it again. I'm not going to just graze over it. But you can see everything still works. Console log still has the exact same data in it. And if I added extra stuff onto my user object, couldn't even type it. Okay, so when you do it this way, one potentially downside is you're passing everything in that object no matter what. Okay, so even with all this extra user information, that's all going to the component as key value pairs. So you can see in our console log, now it has food, drink, and any other thing that would be in that object. Not necessarily a big deal, really. But you do kind of want to make sure you're not sending a lot of superfluous information around because you'll start crowding your props of your components. Because as it is, you're already going to be passing a lot of stuff through your components. Other libraries we're going to be adding onto here, they pass information behind the scenes into your components. So you end up with this huge object that is your props. So you don't necessarily want to clutter with information that you don't intend to use. That's one of those things that's kind of a side note, not really a huge problem. Yes?
There's a lot of errors.
Is it working or your code editor is just throwing errors? Oh, yeah. Something blew up.
Yeah.
I go down 10, resolve, work with reds. Go to meeting. Delete that. Add the import and import. Yeah, just really delete it. Yeah. VS Code, if you you type certain things, it'll auto-generate import statements. I don't even know what does it, but I do all the time too. It tries to be helpful and great stuff. How is everybody feeling about functional components? Pretty good? Think you got the props down, everything seems to be kind of, so far so good? All right, 50% of React already. The easy 50%, the 50%. Might be a small exaggeration. All right, one other thing I want to talk about really quick is the different ways of actually defining your component. Okay, so this is kind of, ES5, I used function keyword, gave it a name, all that fun stuff. Okay, and then exported it at the bottom. If that's how you feel comfortable building them, build them that way. You can even ignore what I'm about to say. If you like being fancy, then pay attention. Even if you don't like being fancy, still pay attention so you can at least recognize it when you see it in other places. So other ways that this could be written is using a fat arrow function. So I could say const greeting equals fat arrow function. Perfectly acceptable. And most commonly, this is probably going to be the way we're going to write them, honestly. But if you don't feel comfortable using the fat arrow functions, then use the function keyword. And like I mentioned yesterday, I think it was yesterday, don't use ES6 and struggle through it just to use ES6. If you understand it one way, stick to using it that way. The better you start understanding that way, the easier it'll be to transition to using ES6. If your grasp is still very tenuous on some of the ES5 concepts, or writing them the kind of older way, it's not going to help you to start writing them in ES6, most likely. All right, so anyways, that's another way. Now, one thing to note, because we're doing other stuff here, we have a couple different returns. We have a conditional, we have a console log, temporary though it may be. So we cannot convert this to just use parentheses to do the implied return, because we cannot just return everything in here. We're returning specific things based on an if statement. So in this case, we have to use the curly brackets. One other thing with fat arrow functions that you guys may or may not be aware of, if you have a single parameter, you don't need parentheses. So you will see stuff like this a lot. I do my best to still put the parentheses, just to help kind of clarify that it's a function a little bit easier. But I can almost promise you I won't do it 100% of the time. My intention is to do it 100% of the time, is to still use parentheses. But when I'm coding on my own, I don't use parentheses, so sometimes I don't do it in front of the class. But I try. So hopefully it doesn't throw anybody off too far. If you ever are looking at anything I type and you have no idea what it does, what should you guys do? Ask. And then I'll either explain it or write it in a different way to hopefully make it a little bit clearer. All right. So you guys know, functions, fat arrow functions, all that stuff. Another thing that you could do that is very common is, instead of saving this to a variable first, is just directly exporting it. So instead of putting the export at the bottom, do it up here, export default export default. There you go. So that works as well, and you can do it with, the function keyword. Same thing. You can directly export it. Okay, you're just defining it and then exporting it.
So if we left it like that, it's still called greeting in the other files. That's what we imported it as, right?
Correct. Because remember, when it's the default export, you can import it as anything. Now, one thing this will do for you, or will not do for you, I guess is a better way to say it, is I'm sure most of you guys have noticed this message in the console. Okay, there are some React Dev tools that you could install for Chrome. They're pretty neat. What they do is they give you kind of like a view like the DOM here. And notice all that crazy React stuff we wrote, it all gets turned into real HTML. And notice we don't see greeting anywhere. We just see the H1 where the greeting was supposed to be. But anyways, the point I was making about the React Dev tools is you get a view like this, but it would still show you that, like, hey, this is a greeting component, this is whatever component, app component with greeting components inside of it. Some people like that view, and it works for them. You can also like highlight a component, and it'll tell you like all the props that are being passed to it. It's pretty useful, especially in the beginning. I would recommend, at least trying them out. If you end up not using them or not like them, you can always uninstall it. But what brought this all on is if you do an anonymous function here, then in the React DevTools, it won't know the name of it. Okay, so you have to give it a name when you export it, otherwise it'll be a little bit tougher to debug. Or maybe you can't do that with a... I think you just got to create the variable first and then export it. I don't think you can do that with one line. So you'd have to do it the way we were doing it before. There was a way to do it. Oh. Multi-lines are doing it at the bottom is perfectly fine. So if you plan on using the React DevTools, like I said, it might be more beneficial to create the constant, store it in the constant, and then export it at the bottom. Plan on using the React DevTools, then it really doesn't matter. There's no like performance gain or boost from doing it one way or the other. What else about functional components? I think that's about it. So what I want you guys to do in small groups is partner up with the people immediately close to you. So pretty much just your neighbor. You guys in the back are screwing up the whole system.
Zero front back.
Man. Genius. Yeah, so you guys, can do front back. If you don't like your neighbor, I totally understand. If you guys want to move around a little bit, that's fine. But what I want you guys to do is in today's agenda, so if you look in the slides for the functional components, the slides go over pretty much everything we just talked about, but definitely double check my story on that. Get exposure to see it again. But at the end of the slides, there is a little challenge. So one thing it's going to have you do is create a new branch. So the current branch you're on, add and commit it, and check back out to master, and then create a new branch to do the little challenge at the end of the slides. Everybody understand that? Okay. If not, let me know or ask whoever you partner with. Like I said, seriously, if you don't want to work with the person next to you and you guys could come to an agreement, feel free to move around a little bit. But just work through it. It's pretty much doing what we just did, but now on your own without me, walking you through it and rambling on a whole bunch like I'm doing right now. So I'll give you guys about 30, 45 minutes. If you want to take a quick break first, of course, do so. And go to it. I'll see you guys back shortly.